How might Jerusalem have sounded in the early hours of that morning, when death seemed to have won and yet was about to be defeated forever? After the heavy silence of Saturday, after the pain, the fear, and the cross, a different morning arrived. It was cold, still dark, and in that fragile hour, a group of women made their way toward a tomb. They believed they were going to honor a body, but without realizing it, they were stepping into the most decisive dawn in all of biblical history. This was no ordinary sunrise. The city still carried the open wound of the crucifixion. Jerusalem had endured unbearable hours. Friday had left behind blood, rumors, shouting, confusion, soldiers on watch, disciples scattered, hearts shattered. Then came Saturday, wrapped in enforced silence. It was as if the entire city had been suspended, caught somewhere between religious obedience and a grief no one fully knew how to express. And when that night finally passed, when the first day of the week began to rise over the stone rooftops and narrow streets of the holy city, the world still seemed covered in the same shadow. The streets were not crowded as they had been during the height of the feast. Some corners felt unnaturally still. Others were likely filled with people trying to make sense of what had happened in the previous hours. Because the death of Jesus Christ had not been quiet or unnoticed. It had been public, humiliating, painful, witnessed by many. His execution had been etched into the memory of those who loved him, and also those who rejected him. And now, as the first light of dawn began to stretch faintly across Jerusalem, everything suggested that the story had ended in the cruelest possible way. For his closest followers, the blow had been devastating. They had watched their teacher fall, the one who healed the sick, comforted the broken, challenged hypocrisy, and spoke of the kingdom of God with an authority no one could imitate. They had seen him die on a Roman cross. They had seen his body taken down. They knew it had been placed in a new tomb, sealed with a massive stone. And in the middle of their grief, there was fear. Because if this had been done to him, what would happen next to those who had walked beside him? It was into this atmosphere, thick with mourning and confusion, that a group of women set out. The Gospels preserve their names. Among the first witnesses of that morning were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and according to other accounts, additional women who had followed Jesus Christ closely. They were not driven by expectations of victory. They were not imagining a triumph. They went because they loved, because love keeps moving toward the wounded, even when hope feels gone. They went to complete what Friday's urgency had interrupted, to finish the acts of honor and care that had been left undone. You can almost picture their steps along the narrow paths, still damp with the morning dew. The sky was just beginning to lighten. The city was slowly waking, but the sorrow they carried had not rested. They brought with them aromatic spices, prepared to anoint the body. It was an act of reverence, of mourning, of loyalty. And as they walked, there was also a very practical concern weighing on them, almost as heavy as the grief in their hearts. The stone, that massive stone sealing the entrance of the tomb. This was no minor detail. It was a real barrier. Who was going to move it for them? How would they get inside? Even in the middle of grief, reality still pressed its questions on them. And so they arrived, not with confidence in a miracle, but with the bitter logic of those expecting to find a dead body. That changes everything. Because Resurrection Sunday did not begin with a crowd celebrating. It began with a small group of wounded, exhausted, and bewildered people. It began with tears, not hymns. It began under the shadow of loss. And that is exactly why what happened next was so overwhelming. As they approached the place, they noticed something impossible. The stone was no longer where it should have been. This was not a slight shift, not a trick of the dim morning light. The stone had been rolled away. The tomb was open. In that instant, their grief had to collide with another kind of shock, alarm. Because for those arriving to care for the dead, an open tomb did not at first feel like good news. It was terrifying. It meant something had broken the expected order of things. They stepped closer or looked inside with their hearts pounding. And then came the most disorienting blow of all. The body was not there. The place where Jesus should have been was empty. The tomb remained. The signs of burial remained. The recent memory of death remained. but he was not there. That absence weighed more heavily than any stone ever could. This was not just any emptiness. It was an emptiness that defied every immediate explanation. The gospel accounts show that their first reaction was not instant understanding, but a deep mixture of fear, confusion, and astonishment. It was not easy to move from the scene of the cross to the reality of resurrection in a single moment. The pain was still too fresh. The wound of Friday was still burning. So when the women saw the empty tomb, they did not immediately run towards some glorious conclusion. They were shaken by uncertainty. In one account, heavenly messengers appear in shining garments. In another, an angel stands by the tomb. But in every account, the message points to the same center, the truth that changed history forever. He is not here. He has risen. What a moment that must have been. The cold morning air, the stone moved aside, the interior of the tomb, their broken breathing, tears still present, and then suddenly those impossible words breaking through the horror of everything that had just happened. This was not a metaphor meant to comfort a devastated group of mourners. It was not a poetic way of saying that Jesus' legacy would live on. It was a direct, concrete, historical, and spiritual declaration. The crucified one was no longer in the grave, because the grave could no longer hold him. There was also a call to remember that he had said this would happen, to remember that he had foretold both his suffering and his resurrection. And yet, in the moment of loss, those words had not been fully understood. Many times the truth has already been spoken right in front of us, but pain keeps us from seeing it until heaven makes it impossible to deny. That morning, the women didn't just encounter an empty tomb. They were confronted with something far deeper, a need to reinterpret everything they had lived with Jesus Christ in light of a reality that would forever change the meaning of the cross. The cross, which had looked like the end, began to reveal itself as a threshold. The stone that seemed to seal defeat had been moved aside. The tomb, which represented the final power of death, became a silent witness that something greater had broken into history. Jerusalem was still the same, stone walls, ancient streets, familiar paths, but from that morning on, it was no longer just the city where Jesus had been crucified. It became the city that first received the news that he had risen. Sometimes a single word is enough to remember the dawn that changed everything. The women left that place with their souls shaken. The Gospels reveal that intense tension within them, fear and joy intertwined, trembling mixed with urgency. What they had seen and heard was too weighty to keep to themselves, and yet too overwhelming to fully process. They moved quickly, thoughts racing, words colliding in their minds, hearts struggling to catch up with what their eyes had already witnessed. And as they hurried forward, that morning began to extend its impact beyond the tomb. The news reached the disciples, but it was not received with calm expectation. On the contrary, the first reaction described in the accounts is disbelief, confusion, difficulty accepting something so far beyond ordinary human experience. They too had been marked by the trauma of the crucifixion. They too had seen Jesus Christ die. They too had lived through that heavy Saturday, weighed down by fear. Some were hiding, others were likely crushed by guilt, like St. Peter after denying his teacher. The resurrection did not break into a triumphant, confident group. It came into a wounded community. That is why the news of the empty tomb at first must have sounded almost impossible to believe. And yet, something in the testimony of those women ignited movement. St. Peter, and according to another account, the beloved disciple, ran toward the tomb. That run carries enormous weight. It is the run of those who do not yet know what they are running toward, whether it is scandal, theft, confusion, or the greatest possibility ever imagined. It is the run of hope wrestling against fear. Picture the scene, the city beginning to wake, morning light growing stronger, two men running through streets and narrow paths, their chests tight, still carrying the memory of Friday. They arrive at the tomb, they see it open, they look inside, they notice the linen cloths, and something feels different. The place does not look like the aftermath of a chaotic disturbance. Instead, everything suggests something else, something beyond a simple human act. There is a strange order, an absence that spoke too clearly, a silent trace of victory, And yet, even there, full understanding did not arrive all at once. Resurrection Sunday was not a simple, immediate realization. It unfolded as a dawn of progressive revelation. First, the shock that didn't embroil in the search, then the memory of what Jesus Christ had said, then the signs, and later the appearances. The faith born that morning was not an easy emotion. It was a conviction that forced its way through grief, doubt, and fear. That is part of the deep beauty of this story. The resurrection was not presented to naive people willing to believe anything. It was announced to men and women who understood exactly what a sealed tomb meant. It was received by people who knew the weight of death and the brutality of empire. It was proclaimed in a city that, only days earlier, had shouted, argued, judged, and condemned. And even in that harsh setting, life broke through with a force no one could contain. Mary Magdalene holds a particularly moving place in that morning. Her grief appears in the accounts with a closeness that is hard to ignore. She had come to the tomb with love, with real mourning, real tears. And in that same place, she became one of the first to experience the complete turning point of history. She moved from weeping over absence to encountering the living presence of the risen Lord. That transition carries one of the most powerful truths of the Christian faith. The place of tears can become the place of encounter. None of this erases the gravity of the cross. The resurrection does not cancel suffering as if it never happened. It does not minimize wounds. It does not deny the darkness of Friday. On the contrary, it passes through it and overcomes it. The risen Christ is the same one who was crucified. The victory of Sunday does not come by ignoring pain, but by emerging from it with a glory that death could not extinguish. That is why this morning is so decisive, because it does not offer cheap hope. It offers a hope that has passed through the grave and come out victorious. In Jerusalem, that news must have spread at different speeds and with very different reactions. For some, it was an incomprehensible rumor. For others, a threat. For the followers of Jesus Christ, it was a total upheaval. The same city that had witnessed the public humiliation of their teacher was now becoming the stage for a message that could not be silenced. And even though many did not fully understand it at first, nothing was ever the same after that morning. The spiritual force of the resurrection lies precisely in that contrast. Everything had pointed toward failure. The cross had displayed weakness, abandonment, violence, and shame. The enemies could have believed the case was closed. The stone could have seemed like the final signature on an irreversible defeat. But Sunday revealed something else. The power of God does not always move according to what is immediately visible. Where the world saw an ending, God was preparing a beginning. Where men saw a grave, God was raising life. Where fear closed doors, God was opening a hope that will reach across centuries. For those who were there, the resurrection was not just a future doctrine. It was an earthquake of the soul. It meant that Jesus had told the truth. It meant that his authority did not end at the cross. It meant that sin, evil, and death did not have the final word. It meant that the kingdom he had proclaimed had not been defeated by Rome, by the Sanhedrin, by betrayal, or by nails. It meant that the apparent victory of darkness had only been temporary. And for the biblical story as a whole, that morning became a key that unlocked everything. So many promises, so many images, so many ancient hopes, all of them began to come together with a new clarity. The God who had parted the sea, sustained his people, spoken through the prophets, and promised redemption was now acting in the most astonishing way in the person of the risen Jesus. Resurrection Sunday was not an isolated episode. It was the great turning point of the biblical narrative, the moment when promise and fulfillment embraced in an irreversible way. That is why the empty tomb should not be seen merely as a surprising detail from an ancient morning. It is the visible sign of an immense truth. The place where people expected to find a body became the place from which Christian hope began to spread. It did not happen in a palace. It did not happen on a stage of political prestige. It did not happen in the middle of a display of human power. It happened in the earliest hours of the day, among stone, silence, tears, and astonishment. There, a certainty began to rise that would change lives, communities, and entire generations. There is something deeply moving about the thought that the first light of that Sunday found some still weeping, others hiding, and others confused. The resurrection came to real people, broken, limited, afraid. That makes it even more powerful, because it shows that God did not wait for everyone to become strong before revealing his victory. He revealed it in the middle of human fragility. He announced it where there was mourning. He lit it where there was confusion. He made it shine at a dawn that, humanly speaking, still seemed covered in ashes. Maybe that is why this story still speaks with such force, because everyone knows in one way or another what it is like to face a morning when pain seems to have won. Everyone knows moments when a stone feels too heavy, when the tomb feels too final, when hope seems to have arrived too late. And yet Resurrection Sunday proclaims that God can break in precisely there, where human beings see only closure. It proclaims that silence is not always abandonment. It proclaims that darkness may be the final hour before the most important dawn. That morning in Jerusalem did not merely change the mood of a few disciples, it changed the meaning of history. From that moment on, the cross can no longer be seen without the resurrection, and the resurrection can never be separated from the cross. Together, they reveal a love that descended to the deepest place, and a victory that rose beyond every human expectation. The Christ who died for sinners is the Christ who lives. The one who was wrapped in burial linen left the tomb behind. The one who seemed defeated was revealed as Lord. And perhaps one of the most beautiful details in all of this is that the news was not first entrusted to the most powerful people in Jerusalem, nor to its rulers, not to the soldiers, not to the men who believed they controlled history. It began to make its way through the testimony of faithful women, through confused disciples, through wounded hearts. That is often how God works, not according to the logic of prestige, but according to the truth of his purpose. The most important dawn in the history of the world was first seen by people who had only gone out to mourn their teacher. That is the power of Sunday. It is not merely the remembrance of something extraordinary that happened once. It is the proclamation that Jesus lives, that death could not hold him, and that Christian hope is not built on a noble memory, but on a risen Lord. That is why this morning still shakes the soul, because it does not speak only about the past, it speaks about the very center of faith. It speaks about the moment when mourning began to lose ground, when fear began to be challenged, and when history received a message no empire could silence. Imagine for a moment the sun rising higher over Jerusalem, casting clearer light across walls, courtyards, stairways, and rooftops. The city appears the same, but it is not. Somewhere, women are still trembling as they remember what they saw. Elsewhere, disciples are trying to grasp the unthinkable. The tomb remains there, open, silent, unable to reclaim the one it once received. And over all of it rises a truth that will never be brought down again. Jesus has risen. That is the news that changed that morning, and it is still changing hearts today. Because if he rose, then the cross was victory, not defeat. If he rose, then despair does not have the final word. If he rose, then human history is not sealed by the grave, but opened by the life of God. Resurrection Sunday in biblical times was not simply a memorable sunrise. It was the dawn that split history in two. If this message touched your life, subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and write Sunday in the comments. And keep walking with us through every piece of content about Jesus, the Bible, and real life in biblical times. Because understanding those ancient mornings helps us look at our present nights with greater hope. The tomb was left empty, the stone was rolled away. And the most decisive dawn of the Christian faith still declares, with a force that cannot be extinguished, life won.